The young and the restless spoilers shock. Nick had always been a man of principle, flawed, yes, but guided by a sense of right and wrong instilled in him by years of pain, legacy, and responsibility. But all of that began to erode the moment he was placed under house arrest, shackled by accusations that branded him a murderer. The very walls of his home, once a place of safety and peace, began to close in on him like the cold steel bars of a prison he didn't deserve. The idea that people he once called friends, even family, could genuinely suspect he had taken a life, Damien's life, was something he couldn't fathom. It wasn't just the physical confinement that wore him down, it was the injustice. The silence. The whispers. The weight of false guilt hung around his neck like an anchor, dragging him toward the abyss of madness. He wandered the halls like a lion in a cage, prowling, unpredictable, filled with simmering rage and desperation. There was a time when Nick would have sat down, waited for the truth to rise like oil in water, but not anymore. That man, the patient man, the man who trusted justice, was gone. What remained was a shadow, a version of himself cracked and trembling, ready to shatter at the slightest push. And then there was Carter. Nick didn't know much about the man, where he came from, who he truly worked for, or why he had been given the authority to police Nick's life. But what he did know was that Carter didn't belong. He wasn't family. He wasn't law enforcement. He wasn't even part of the Newman orbit. He was an outsider with cold eyes and a colder heart, a hired hand pretending to be a judge and jury. Carter moved through Nick's home like he owned it, issuing orders, setting boundaries, acting as if Nick's freedom was his to grant or revoke. The tension between them was volatile from the start, but it began to boil the moment Carter blocked Nick from leaving the house. The confrontation started as a growl, a warning exchanged in clenched jaws and low voices, but it escalated quickly. Carter underestimated the fury that had built inside Nick, fury not just at him, but at the entire world that had turned against him. Nick surged forward, fists clenched, teeth bared, unleashing weeks of pent-up anguish and humiliation. But Carter wasn't just some muscle-bound lackey, he was trained, calm, and brutal. With calculated ease, he deflected Nick's blows, twisted him around, and with one swift motion, drove a blade into his side. The world slowed for a moment. The pain didn't come immediately, it was the shock, the sheer disbelief that stole the breath from Nick's lungs. He stumbled backward, clutching his side, eyes wide with betrayal and horror. Blood soaked through his shirt, warm and unforgiving, and for a terrifying second, he wondered if this was how it ended. Carter stared at him without remorse, breathing heavily but standing tall, as if daring Nick to challenge him again. But the injury, while deep, wasn't fatal. Carter knew exactly where to stab to disable but not kill, a lesson in power, a warning disguised as punishment. Nick collapsed onto the floor, gasping, struggling to stay conscious as the crimson stain spread across his torso. And then, as if summoned by fate or fury, Sharon and Sally burst through the door. Their voices cut through the thick air like razors, cries of horror and disbelief echoing through the house. Sharon dropped to her knees beside Nick, frantically applying pressure to the wound with trembling hands, her eyes wide with panic and pain. Sally hovered just behind, dialing 911, screaming into the phone for help, demanding an ambulance. But Carter wasn't finished. He turned to them with the same cold detachment he'd shown Nick, stepping forward slowly like a predator who had just found 2 more targets. "Put the phone down," he growled, voice low and menacing. Sally froze. Sharon's breath caught. "If either of you makes another sound," Carter continued, "you'll end up worse than him." The threat was real. His hand hovered near his belt, near the same blade that still glistened faintly with Nick's blood. For a moment, time stood still. The air was heavy with dread. Sharon stared up at him with equal parts terror and defiance, her mind racing with possibilities. Could she reach the drawer where she kept the pepper spray? Would she have time to shield Nick if Carter lunged again? Every instinct screamed to protect the man she once loved, the father of her child, the soul tethered to hers in ways too complex to untangle. Sally, too, was frozen between fear and fury, fingers trembling but eyes burning with resolve. The women didn't scream again, not aloud, but their eyes shouted volumes. They knew they were dealing with a man who didn't fear consequences, a man who had just crossed the line from enforcer to assailant, and who would not hesitate to silence anyone who got in his way. Sharon continued to press against Nick's wound, whispering reassurances through clenched teeth as tears slipped down her cheeks. Nick's skin was pale, but his eyes remained open, locked onto hers, silently pleading for strength, for salvation. Sally stepped back, slowly, as if yielding, but she wasn't giving up. She was scanning the room for something, anything that could become a weapon. Her gaze flicked toward the fireplace poker just a few feet away. She had one shot, and she knew it. Meanwhile, Carter paced like a caged beast, calculating his next move. He hadn't expected witnesses. He hadn't expected resistance. He was trained for violence, yes, but even he understood the storm this would bring if it leaked beyond these walls. He looked down at Nick and sneered. Next time, he muttered, you'll stay put. But there might not be a next time. Nick, even through the pain, understood now, this wasn't about justice or punishment. This was personal. This was control. Someone wanted him broken, silenced, erased. And Carter was just the knife that delivered the message. Sharon's hands never left him, her whispers never stopped. Sally, in a moment of bold defiance, lunged for the poker, gripping it tightly as she stood tall, facing Carter like a warrior prepared to strike. Don't touch him again, she hissed, her voice low but deadly. Carter's eyes narrowed. The tension exploded into silence. The next move would define all their fates. And in that moment, the truth became clear, this wasn't just a fight for Nick's name or his freedom. It was a battle for survival. A war waged not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but inside a home that had become a battlefield. And as blood soaked the floor, and fear wrapped its icy fingers around them, Sharon and Sally stood as his last line of defense. The house arrest had failed. The man they tried to imprison was already gone. In his place stood someone darker, someone wounded, someone ready to fight back. And when the reckoning came, it wouldn't be quiet. It would roar like a fire finally given air. Nick lay on the cold floor, his blood seeping into the hardwood as his body trembled between pain and rage. The wound may not have killed him, but it had ignited something darker, an inferno within. Carter's retreat into the shadows of the house only served as fuel to Nick's spiraling hatred. Every breath Nick took was laced with fury, not just at the man who had stabbed him, but at the force behind it all, the puppet master who orchestrated this humiliation, this violence, this psychological war. It couldn't just be Carter acting alone. There was too much calculation in his movements, too much confidence in his authority. This wasn't law. This was design. And in that agonizing clarity, as Sharon bandaged his wound and Sally stood guard with the fire poker still gripped tight, Nick saw the truth with a cold, sharp finality. This was Cain. It had always been Cain. Cain, who had smiled at him just days earlier. Cain, who had insisted he was the target, the victim, the misunderstood man trapped by fate. But it was all a lie, a grand illusion designed to shift suspicion away from him while slowly twisting Nick into something unrecognizable. And the plan was working. Nick could feel it in his bones. The rage. The loss of control. The thirst for retribution. Cain didn't just want Nick destroyed, he wanted him transformed. He wanted to mold him into the very thing everyone feared, a killer. And when Nick finally broke, when he finally lashed out and silenced Carter with blood on his hands, Cain would sit back, nodding with satisfaction, because the trap would be complete. Nick would be locked away not for the murder of Damien, but for the murder of Carter, a crime born from desperation, pain, and manipulation. Nick pounded his fist against the floor, the pain in his side flaring again, but it was nothing compared to the fury in his chest. Sharon hovered beside him, her eyes filled with tears, but also with something else now, conviction. She had seen it in Carter's face. The cruelty. The disdain. She had seen the way Nick tried to protect her even while bleeding. Whatever doubts she had harbored, whatever confusion had plagued her since the accusations first surfaced, those were gone. Nick wasn't a murderer. He wasn't capable of what they had claimed. He had been set up, pushed, cornered until the only way forward was to claw his way through the lies. She gently touched his face, whispering through her tears, "This isn't you. And I know that now. I'm sorry I ever questioned it." But Nick wasn't listening. Not truly. His mind was already racing through the endless nights of whispered rumors, the strange phone calls, the way Kane always seemed one step ahead. It all made sense now. Kane hadn't just framed him, he had built a stage for him to perform his downfall in public view. And the worst part? Nick had almost played his role to perfection. If Sharon and Sally hadn't shown up, Carter might have bled him out or taunted him until he snapped. And then what? One more body, one more crime, one more charge to add to the list. Kane's brilliance wasn't just in the setup. It was in the patience. The psychological trap was elegant. Plant the seed. Water it with isolation and injustice. Then watch it bloom into violence. Nick clenched his jaw, trembling with rage. "I'll kill him," he spat under his breath, eyes dark, wild. "I swear to God, I'll kill Carter. And Kane too, if I have to." Sharon's eyes widened, but she didn't flinch. She understood this was no longer just about clearing Nick's name. This was about stopping Kane before he destroyed anyone else. The man had woven himself into the lives of everyone, Amanda, Lily, Audra, even Phyllis in some twisted way, and no one had seen the monster behind the charm. As the night dragged on, Nick's strength slowly returned. Sharon refused to leave his side. Sally eventually collapsed onto the couch, still holding the poker like a lifeline. But there was no peace. Only strategy. Because now, Nick knew what had to be done. He couldn't just clear his name, he had to expose the architect of this horror. But Kane wouldn't go down easily. He was too careful, too revered by those around him. Everyone saw him as the misunderstood victim of circumstance. But Nick had seen behind the curtain now. And what he saw was terrifying. Kane wasn't trying to cover up a murder, he was engineering one. He had built an environment of suspicion, of fear, of violence, and then thrown Nick into the center like a lab rat in a cage. And now, he waited for the results. For the moment when Nick broke entirely and became the man they accused him of being. But Nick wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Not yet. He would bide his time, gather the proof, and bring everything crashing down around Kane's smug little empire. Because this wasn't just personal anymore, it was war. And Sharon, having seen Carter's blade and heard Nick's truth, was no longer a bystander. She was an ally. A witness. A protector. She would help him stay grounded, stay focused. But deep inside, Nick still trembled. Because the desire to retaliate, to rip Carter apart with his bare hands, burned inside him like acid. And that was the most terrifying part. Kane had done more than try to frame him, he had altered him. Tainted him. Bent his soul toward violence and revenge. And now, Nick wasn't sure he could ever fully return to the man he once was. Still, one truth remained unshaken, Carter had stabbed him. Not just physically, but symbolically. And Kane had orchestrated it all. That was the real crime. The real betrayal. The real evil. And as the hours passed and the moon hung heavy over the Newman estate, Nick sat up, gritting his teeth, blood dried across his side, a hand tightly gripping Sharon's. His voice was raw but steady when he whispered, "He's going to pay. For everything." Sharon didn't stop him. She didn't argue. Because she knew he was right. And somewhere, in a luxurious suite far from this chaos, Kane Ashby sipped his bourbon and smiled, knowing the wheels were turning exactly as he'd planned. Because Kane didn't need to kill Nick. He only needed to push him to kill someone else. And then, Nick's fate would be sealed. Unless someone stops it.